Welcome to PM 10 Minutes, your project management added value. Keynote speakers of the PM Forum 2010 interviewed by Andreas Heilwart, produced by the PJMB blog in cooperation with the German Society for Project Management GPM. Welcome to a new episode of PM 10 Minutes. Today's guest is Tom deMarco. He is principal of the Atlantic Systems Guild and author of highly regarded books like Slack and Adrenalin, Junkies and Template Zombies, as well as 10 other books. Hello, Tom.
Hey, Andreas. How are you?
I'm fine. And you?
Very good. Thank you.
So I heard that you will do a keynote presentation at the PM Forum in October in Berlin. And you will be speaking about complex systems. What are complex systems for you?
Well, of course, all systems are complex. The very definition of the word system implies a certain amount of complexity. I mean, you wouldn't call a shovel complex because it doesn't have, you wouldn't call a shovel a system because it doesn't have the complexity of interacting parts. But the thing that I am most aware of at the moment is how much complexity and has changed just as a function of size changing over my lifetime. The very typical system we build today is measured in the millions of lines of computers of code, and that would have been entirely unheard of as late as the early 1980s. In fact, the first million-line program that I knew of was the automation of the NASDAQ, the National Stock Exchange, the Curb Stock Exchange in New York. That was a little over 1 million lines of code, and that was late 70s or early 80s. And at that time, we were astounded that anybody could build a system that's that big. Well, what's happened since? What's happened since is that systems, the average size of the systems we're building has increased more or less consistent with Moore's law. As the size of computers have increased, so that the size in lines of code of the software as well. And now I come up with a quandary. The quandary is that if the size of the average system has doubled every 18 months since the 1970s, and most of our methods for doing anything in software come from the 1970s and early 80s, have we outgrown our methods? And my short answer is yes, we've long since outgrown the methods just because the systems are becoming so large. Now, one of the things that I'm aware of recently from working with several German companies, Daimler in particular, but also Siemens, is huge systems suddenly being ubiquitous. Like take for example the Daimler, the Mercedes S-Class vehicle has 25 million lines of code on board. 25 million lines of code in one vehicle, and that's a car. I mean, that's not the most computer-intensive thing on Earth. I don't know what the most computer-intensive thing on Earth is, but it's certainly something. Maybe an aircraft. Yeah. When they built the Boeing 777 project, it was about, I'm winging it here, but I think it was 6 million lines of code. I'm betting that a modern aircraft today would be closer to 60 million lines of code.
Okay. So we have an example or several examples for complex systems, and you're right, our methods are very old, and I looked up the source of the Gantt chart, and it's at least 100 years old. So what do you think will be the major breakthroughs to provide us with new methodologies or new approaches to manage the creation of such new systems?
Well, I think the major breakthrough is, and has been, I'm not claiming that I've invented this. I mean, I think it's happening. We're doing this in order to survive. The major breakthrough is in design, the way we go about design. Design used to be a very solitary business. You have the one person, the guy that's famous for being a geek, which means not very social, and he closes himself off in his office and he comes up with a design, and then maybe other people help him build it. and that is the model that we've seen in the past. And it's the model that most systems still embrace, although nobody really can do it anymore. Design now has to be something that's shared by an entire group of people. When you're talking about building a system that's got hundreds or scores of millions of lines of code, one thing that's very obvious is we need a team to build it. No single individual could build a system with even 1 million lines of code. He doesn't live long enough to crank that much total information through his brain. He is limited by the bandwidth, his own bandwidth, his ability to absorb information. Every bit of information, here I'm talking information theory, every bit of information that ends up in a computer system, in software, has to be at one time in a human brain. It has to pass into and out of one human brain. In fact, in most cases, more than one, because you typically show it to somebody else or somebody checks it. So every bit that goes into a piece of software, every information theory bit that gets into software has to be in a human brain at one time. And the bandwidth of the human brain is such that it's almost impossible for a human to live long enough to write 1 million lines of code. So if you're building a system that's got, 60 million lines of code, one thing that's very obvious is the code has to be spread over a large number of people. So the team size has increased. Well, we understand that about code, but what we haven't, I think, explicitly understood it about is the design process. We've still got in our minds this idea that design might be something that's done by one geek in his solitary reaches of his office. And I just don't think that's true anymore. Well, most people listening to this will say, oh, yes, but the geek, the solitary worker, can do the upper level of the design. She does the top of the design. And then lower level designers come along and they do the lower part of the design. And I think that idea was always flawed. I think that was always a mistake. The design has to be done by all of the people who are involved in building the project, because when they actually implement the lowest level piece, they almost inevitably find some aspect of it that needs to be changed in its interface to some other aspect that lies outside their domain. And so as coders, they sit at their desks and they call each other, call across the room and say, could you pass me such and such a piece of data? Could you share with me your timing for doing this or that task so that I can see it, so I can use that as a control signal as to when I do whatever it is that I'm doing. And when they make that decision, a side effect of coding, they are changing the design. Well, are they changing the design in an acceptable way? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But if they never go back if they never take their coding hat off and put their design hat on and say, well, no, wait a minute, maybe I just invalidated the design, or maybe there's now a better alternative, then what they're doing is they're defeating the design as they proceed. And we're ending up with something with a design which has not been so much designed as it has been evolved. Now, I'd like to call your attention to the difference between something that's designed by humans, a system that's designed by humans, and a system that has evolved. Let's take, as a system that's designed by humans, the technique we use for Ethernet, the Ethernet protocol. And now let's take as a system that has evolved the human body or any biological system. There's a huge difference between the two. The design system, the human design system, is always made up of small pieces loosely joined to each other. And the natural or evolved system is exactly the opposite. It's made up of large pieces tightly joined to each other. Think about the weather system. We can't say today whether the Earth is warming or not. We can't say it with perfect assurance enough to convince everybody. Why is that? It's because the weather system is made up of large pieces, loosely joined, and it doesn't ever fit into the human brain. Human design systems are made up of small pieces loosely joined, and that's why we can understand them. We can wrap our minds around them. But if we don't design our systems, if rather we let them evolve through the process of the noisy process of the interaction of huge teams of people interacting not in design mode but in coding mode, we're going to end up with a system which is very tightly joined, that the pieces, the boundaries between the pieces are much less clean, so we've got big pieces that are tightly joined to each other. And that is our undoing. We cannot perfect systems that are made up of large pieces tightly joined.
Another aspect of complex systems is the dangerous assumption that if you increase the number of components, the complexity will increase as a linear function. That's not the case, because if you build larger systems and more people become involved, the communication is way more complex than a linear function. And I think this relates to our discussion about corporate culture. And now here comes my question. How does this new complexity relate to corporate culture and your presentation at the PM Forum in Berlin?
Okay, what I'm going to talk about in Berlin is the imperative to approach the design activities as a totally collaborative matter. In the past, we've talked about design teams, small design teams, 4 or 5 people at the very most, with one geek who's really in charge. Now I think we're going to talk about initially small design teams, but little by little, during the course of the project, virtually everybody on the project becomes a designer, becomes part of the design process, and does that not as acting as an individual, not in solitude, but through this highly social experience of working out the interfaces between the pieces and elevating that to the original design team so that they can reconsider if perhaps their design concept was perhaps not the optimal. There are 2 things happening here. One is the design becomes, 1, more collaborative, and 2, more iterative. More iterative because we have to continually go back into the process of design evaluation and reconsideration that maybe we need a slightly different design.
Wow, that sounds really interesting, and thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to hear your keynote presentation in Berlin.
I'm looking forward to meeting you there and shaking hands personally, Andreas.
This is the end of PM 10 Minutes, your project management added value today. Subscribe to the podcast on pm-10-minutes.de and look out for the next episode.